Okay, welcome, Richard.
Thank you.
Kiitos. Thread of Night is about a young reporter in Berkeley in 1941 who uncovers evidence of Nazi spies operating in the area. And it's about his efforts to uncover those spies and reveal the identity of their mysterious leader. But in addition to wanting, as every author does, to write an entertaining and engaging story, I wanted to do something more with the book. I wanted to write a sort of love letter to the kind of Finnish community that I grew up in Berkeley. I was born in Berkeley in 1954, and my father was from Finland. He emigrated here in the 1940s. I am a Hourula, to whom the book is dedicated. And my mother was born in San Francisco, but to Finnish parents. And she grew up here in Berkeley in a house on Sacramento between Cedar and Rose. So I grew up surrounded by not only my parents, but my aunts and uncles and cousins and all the other many Finns in the area. And it was a great childhood because of that. And I wanted to recreate that through my main character, Matti Kurki, or the anglicized name, Matti Kurki. So for the story, I had not only Matti, but his parents and his sister, his aunt and uncle, and his cousins, and many other Finns living in Berkeley. One of the goals I had was to create a duality. While Matti is in pursuit of these murderous, racist, horrible Nazis, he's also got this loving family and this supportive group of Finns that he lives among. And he's also got a Finnish-American girlfriend, Martta, who is a Minnesota-born Finn. In creating this duality, I was trying to show how so much of our lives have that. For example, we read about pandemics and wars in Ukraine and global warming, but then we also have our families and activities that we use to entertain ourselves with. So we live in kind of two worlds sometimes. I think a really good example of that is the work my youngest daughter does as a social worker. She counsels sexual abuse victims who are going through the court system. Not a very pleasant thing to do, although rewarding in many ways. So she's able to contrast that with a rich social life and friends and family and the activities that she enjoys. Is it better if I talk without the mask? You think? Yeah, I think I can do that. I'm far enough away. So anyway, before I talk about the book, what I'll do is I'll read an excerpt from the book, and then I'll answer any questions you have. I thought I'd give a little background on Berkeley as a Finn town. That's something I heard all the time from my father, that Berkeley was a real Finn town, and it was, and it remained so for a long time. The first Finns showed up in the Berkeley census in 1900, and there were about 68 of them. By 1920, there was about 648 Finns in the Berkeley census, but that's only Finnish-born citizens. There were also, by now, second-generation Finns. The first Finnish establishment was a church built in 1901 on 10th and Channing Way. And let's see it. I have a picture of that right here. A second church was built, and it's right here on Byron and Alston Way. and that was in 1912. And these were both Lutheran churches that gave services in Finnish. By 1912, a Finnish brotherhood was created, and it was truly a brotherhood because it only had male members. At the same time, though, there was a Finnish sisterhood, which only had female members. By 1915, they came up with a great idea, as men and women often do, to get together. So there was just the one brotherhood. Part of the growth in the Finnish community came in Berkeley after the 1906 earthquake, which devastated certain parts of San Francisco, including the area where a lot of Finns lived. So the Finns came over here. It had a kind of a snowball effect, and the Finnish community just continued to grow and grow. 1917, you had the Russian Revolution and the consequent Finnish independence, which also led to a schism between white and red Finns, the reds being the communists and the whites being everybody else. And while that led to civil war in Finland, among Finnish communities throughout the United States and presumably other places, it led to some divisions. And as a consequence, the Red Hall was, one more. The Red Hall here was built in 1915, I believe. No, wait a second. 1915. It still exists at 10th Street, 1819 10th Street, and the Berkeley Historical Society has a plaque there. This Brotherhood Hall was later built in 1932. Despite the division between the Reds and the Whites, there was great unity otherwise among the Finns. And the Finns were a very visible population. It was a relatively small population, but the visibility came from the fact that they congregated here so much. And also, Berkeley, through the Brotherhood Hall, drew Finns from neighboring areas. There were a lot of Finns in Albany, El Cerrito, Richmond. And when I grew up, there were still a lot of Finns in those areas. And a lot of Finns, even on the other side of the tunnel. I had cousins in Lafayette, Orinda, Walnut Creek. So Berkeley became a hub for Finns all around the Bay Area. And so the Finnish population seemed much bigger than it actually was. As I said, my grandparents grew up, or lived on Sacramento between Cedar and Rose, and around the corner from them was a man named Matti Kurki. And then a few blocks from them were a few other Finns, and there were just Finns all over the place. But again, they seemed more in number just because of their activities. The activities Finns involved in include political ones. They were very active in local politics, supporting various candidates, usually left-leaning candidates. And it's interesting to note that most Finns were Republicans up until Roosevelt became president. And then it was a mass exodus of Finns to the Democratic Party, which remained so when I was a kid. I know my father claimed to only know one Finnish Republican when I was a kid. I don't know if that's true or not. But in any case, Finns were very active in politics. The Finn Hall was often rented out to political organizations for rallies and meetings and conventions and that sort of thing. In the late 1930s, there was what was it? The exact name is Consumers Cooperative Grocery Store, simply known as co-ops, were created. Local Finns were at that time trying to put together a gasoline co-op, but when they heard of the idea for grocery co-op, they jumped on that, and the Finns became leaders in the co-op movement, and soon there were co-ops sprinkled throughout the Bay Area. There were three in Berkeley, one on University in Acton, where there's a Target, one on Shattuck and Cedar, where there's an Andronikos now, and one where the Whole Foods is on Telegraph and Ashby. And it seemed like every Finn was a member of the co-op. And I remember once my mother and I were going to the co-op, and we were walking with this other Finnish woman. And when we got to the co-op, she continued on to go to the Safeway. And I said, why is she going to the Safeway? Don't all Finns go to the co-op? And my mother shrugged. Because seemingly all Finns shopped at the co-ops. At least that's what I was told. The period from the 1930s through the late 1950s was called by one researcher the golden age of Finns or a Finn town, Finns in Berkeley. I think it continued through the 60s. When I was a child, it was pretty active then. And I think the Brotherhood Hall played a large part in that, and it also represents how Finns have been so successful at two things, both assimilating into American culture and maintaining their own heritage. So a strong Finnish community was certainly part of my childhood, and I made it part of Matti's story to contrast again with what he was dealing with in his professional life. So that's a brief history of Finns in Berkeley. I could do more at another occasion if anyone wanted to, but right now I thought I would first read an excerpt from the book and then take questions, and then later I could read another excerpt. Before I do that, I wanted to... Oh, I have more pictures, I'm sorry. This is the Brotherhood Hall. I think it's 1946.
It's in the 40s.
Yeah, it's in the late 40s.
Again. At the post office at City Hall.
Yeah. Oh no, yeah, you're right. That's City Hall. Yeah. But this is the Berkeley Lodge 21 gathering in I think it was 1947. And this is my family, and that's me. My grandmother Jenny Kurki, and my grandfather Emily Kurki, and I am Hourula, my dad, and my mother, and aunts and uncles, and yeah. Oh, and there's my brother Robe. 3 of his children are here today. And one of his children I think we can close this. Yeah. One of the children did the beautiful cover art for my book, and Matlena did this. And it's gotten a lot more praise than the book has. So if you're interested in the book, buy it for the cover. You might want to read it too, but the cover is worth having. I gave her a few ideas, and she put together something that really captures what I feel is the spirit of the book. Okay, so I'm going to read an excerpt. Friday, June 20th was the start of a big weekend of revelry for Finns as we would celebrate Juhannus. It's a time of nationwide festivities highlighted in Finland by huge outdoor bonfires and the copious consumption of spirits. Many of us planned to start the festivities on Friday, and others would continue their bacchanalia through Sunday. Cousin Jussi and I were not the kind who did anything by half measures. So we started by warming up with a few beers at my place in the late afternoon. It was a hot day, especially for Berkeley, and one perfectly suited for drinking beer. If it's going to be this warm, we've got no choice but to drink, Jussi said. I could only concur with the wisdom of his affirmation. As we sat on my front steps inhaling our first beer, my cousin admitted that he'd had a case of blues recently, but reckoned the weekend revelry would cure them. I patted him on the back and said, "You're a good man, Jussi, and you don't deserve to feel anything but happy." Later, Martta and Jussi's girlfriend Sinikka, a recent Finnish immigrant, joined us. The ladies made dinner while we cheered them on from our living room sofa. After eating and showering our girlfriends with compliments, we drove to the Finnish Brotherhood Hall on Chestnut Street. We arrived a few minutes after the scheduled 8 o'clock start, and the hall was already packed. Finns are not ones to be late, fashionably or otherwise. Correct? We found our families who were occupying a table together. Inga-Lisa was ever entertaining everyone with her rendition of the Tarzan yell. Aunt Elsa managed to quiet her down long enough so the first of many toasts could be offered to Jussi for completing his university degree in legal studies. We raised our glasses to our homeland, to the United States, to FDR, to absent relations, and to ourselves. By the time we finished toasting, I was toasted. Martta and my mother were the only adults among us who were abstemious. My parents rarely bickered, but when they did, it was usually about Pop's tippling. Tonight would be such an occasion. It wasn't long before äiti said, "Älä joo niin paljon viini, se ei ole hyväksi sinulle." Pop smiled condescendingly, patted äiti on the head, and upended another shot of vodka. But my father was no match for Uncle Jorma, who could drink Dionysus under the table, which he seemed to be determined to do on this occasion. "We have us a good time tonight, right, Matti Poika?" he said to me while putting his arm around my shoulder and squeezing. With that, we toasted one another, and I was overwhelmed with a light-hearted giddiness that suggested I was getting good and drunk. Therefore, I determined to work the booze off with a few spins on the dance floor with Martta. "Let's go, Kulta," I said, giving my proximity to total intoxication. It wasn't surprising that my dancing resembled a choreographed fit. Meanwhile, Helen and Terry danced by us, and in comparison were Astaire and Rogers. After dancing for 20 minutes, Martta and I mingled. Many other Finns I encountered told me how long they'd known their parents, or how long they'd known my parents, and how they'd known me since I was a little guy. My parents were revered members of the Berkeley Finnish community, and a lot of Finns proudly told me how well or how long they'd known them. I smiled politely, shook hands, and told everyone how nice it was to see them. I take this from my own experiences because whenever I came to Finnish gatherings, as I got older, people would come up to me and tell me how long they'd known my dad. And they were showing off to me how well they knew my father. We were making our way toward the snack table, which featured salted salmon on Finnish rye bread, when a hand grabbed my shoulder. I turned to see Heikki Samakko, a sallow-faced, sickly-looking gent about 30 years of age who I only vaguely knew. He was swaying back and forth in a way that suggested he was several sheets to the wind. I never liked Heikki, who wore a perpetual scowl, although before tonight there was no reason for my disdain. "Hey, Kurki," he slurred, "why don't you write about the real danger in the world? Those dirty, stinking Reds. You all the time got to be poking at the Germans and defending the Jews. Don't you know the Jews are all commie rats? Why don't you go home and sleep it off?" I said to Heikki softly but sternly, at last having a reason to dislike him. "You're supposed to be a Finn, and you should be going after the Reds. Instead, you're buddies with the Jews and probably the Negroes, too." Only he used racial slurs in place of those names. That made me good and sore. I didn't need journalism lessons from this drunken ignoramus, nor did I want to hear racial slurs, especially at a festive occasion. My fist clenched as if I was going to put them to use, but remembering the setting, I took a calming breath. This is a party, and you shouldn't be talking like that and using that sort of language. Besides, you're well in your cups. I decided to move on and try to forget my encounter with Heikki, but the sodded son of a gun physically pulled me back. By now, Martta had taken notice. "Take your hands off Matti. How dare you grab people like that?" Martta was having none of it. "Shut up, you silly bitch," Heikki barked. That was it. I couldn't hold my temper any longer. I roughly pushed Heikki off me, raised both fists in a fighting position, and prepared to unload. Fortunately, a crowd gathered and restrained me as I was about to launch a right cross at Heikki's ugly mug. Heikki looked ill-prepared to trade blows and would have been no match for me anyway, so he was lucky for the intervention. He was roughly escorted out the door, and I was later told, flung down the front steps and told not to return. Apparently, this wasn't the first time he'd caused a ruckus at the Finn Hall. Somehow word of the fracas got to my parents before Martta and I made it back to the table. Äiti was not pleased. She exclaimed angrily, "Matti, this is not the time or place to fight." My mother rarely got angry. Peeved, annoyed, vexed, irritated, miffed, irked were regular states for Matti Kurki. But anger was an extreme rarity, and when it was directed at me, I felt chastened and humbled. As he always did, Pop rose to my defense. Matti on oikea mies. Then switching to English, sometimes you have to stand up to a juopua, like Heikki. What that jätkä say to you? He criticized my writing and said I should focus on the Reds and use bad names for Jews and Negroes. The final straw was when he called Martta a bitch. At this, my mother immediately pronounced, anteeksi. You were right, you should have given him a beating. What a relief to have Äiti back on my side. Damn it, I give Heikki a beating myself, Pop said. Hell, I'll take a couple of pokes at him too, added Jussi. Uncle Jorma said, ja minä auta sinua. Even Gertie and Angelisa offered to participate. I'll slug him harder than Joe Louis ever could, said Angelisa, flexing her tiny muscles. Great, I said. I finally calmed down everyone else, and everyone else is all excited. Can we forget about it and have a good time? And Elsa said, Matti is right. But Martta, you upset? I will be if your nephew doesn't start dancing with me again. With that, we were back on the dance floor. The rest of the evening at the Finn Hall, which lasted until 2 o'clock, was free of any brawls, insults, or arguments, and full of laughter, stories, and dancing, as intended. Saturday's festivities were tamer, with only a modicum of alcohol consumption. We were not only celebrating midsummer, but it was Martta's 21st birthday. That night, we all returned to the Finn Hall for a delicious meal. Äiti, of course, was one of the women who had volunteered to help prepare it. This was a more formal affair than the previous evening, with speeches by prominent local and visiting Finns, traditional Finnish songs performed by a choir, and a Finnish acting troupe's performance. Some champagne was consumed, and Martta, in recognition of turning 21, had one glass. Coffee and sweets capped off the evening for everyone. I'll read one more part. Okay. Oh, yeah, me too. Okay. So this part would have spoilers in it if you haven't read the book, but I changed did this thing go? Oh, there. Yeah. Hi. Would have spoilers in it, but I changed the name of the town and changed the name of the people, so it won't spoil anything for you if you haven't read the book. Okay. It became clear that I would have to do some legwork, which in this case would be by car. Bob Smith had told me that he was from Oakville and that his father had been a bank president there. It seemed worth a trip up there to snoop around. The next day I borrowed my Aunt Elsa's DeSoto and drove the 2.5 hours north. Oakville was a town of about 1,200, located 50 miles south of nowhere. It was pleasant enough looking, but you could see it all in 20 minutes if you took your time. I'm not sure why people lived there unless their hobby was being bored. My first step was Oakville's bank, where I spoke to the current bank manager, who remembered Bob Smith well. He said that the late Mr. Smith indeed had a son named Jack, who proved nothing but trouble. But there was no other son, just a daughter named Priscilla. The bank manager gave me her name, but I didn't know what I would do with it. The more I found out, the less I knew. After talking to the banker, I sat in Aunt Elsa's car, wondering if there was anything else I could usefully do in sleepy little Oakville, Northern California, which was in the midst of what the locals called Indian summer. And as a valley town, Oakville was on full broil. Sitting in the DeSoto, I felt like I was about to be basted. I also felt like an idiot for driving all this way to learn something I could have gotten out of a phone call. I was thinking about going to the local police and seeing what they had to say about Jack Smith and wondering what else I could do there. I was also dreading the long, hot drive home from a wasted trip, much of which would be in the dark, which is where I was on this whole case. Who the heck was this character who posed as Smith? Was there anything I could learn in Oakville before I headed back to Berkeley? Then I saw him. Half a block away, as clear as day, Bill Burns was crossing the street. I drove slowly to the corner he was walking to, watching him closely, unsure what I would do, disbelieving my sudden good fortune. When Burns was directly in front of my car, he turned and looked straight at me. His baby blues opened big and wide. Mine squinted at him. After standing stock still for 2 seconds, Burns broke into a run. I got out of the car and ran after him, not knowing what I'd do with him. I caught up with him. But lucky for him and unlucky for me, a car was waiting. He hopped in and the driver sped off. I ran back to my car and gave chase. They drove through a residential district for 3 blocks before reaching the end of a cul-de-sac. I had them. Excuse me. Or so I thought. After slamming on the brakes, the driver got out and brandished the biggest pistol I'd ever seen, and he was pointing it straight at me. Not wanting to meet, the business end of a bullet, I made a U-turn so fast that it defied the laws of physics, and I drove in the opposite direction for 100 yards. Finally, I stopped and looked back. The armed man was running toward me with his gun pointed at me. I thought about running him over, but I didn't have the nerve, mainly because he'd probably get off a few shots before I hit him. Meanwhile, Burns had taken the wheel and drove up to his partner. I figured that they'd soon be pursuing me. Believing that discretion is the better part of valor, I sped off, turning down one street and then another in hopes of losing them. After 10 minutes of zigzagging around what little there was of Oakville, I pulled into a filling station. There was no sign of my pursuers. My heart was doing the rumba, and my back and sides were wet with sweat. My hands seemed to have a mind of their own, and against my wishes were shaking. I couldn't know for sure if Burns and his companion were looking for me, but I suspected they weren't. Okay, more like I hoped like hell they weren't. I was scared and wanted desperately to be back in Berkeley, safe, secure, and enjoying a complete absence of Nazis. What the heck do you think you're doing chasing after Burns? I asked myself. I could offer no response. I'd followed an instinct to pursue, yet there was nothing I could have done if I'd caught my quarry. Dumb. It was dusk, and I promised Aunt Elsa that she'd have her car back that evening, so I had no choice but to drive back to the Bay Area. First, I found a payphone and called Jarvis, letting him know of my encounter with Burns and discovering that there was no Elliot Smith. Good work, Matt. I wish you'd thought to keep yourself out of harm's way. That could have gone badly for you. You're telling me. I'll send someone up to Oakville in the morning to investigate. Be careful driving back. Once you get back in your car, don't stop along the way. And do us a favor, and don't write about this in the newspaper for a few days. Okay, I can't hold on to this story forever, though. You won't have to. The gas station was adjacent to a cafe, so after filling the gas tank, I ordered a sandwich and soda and was on the road 20 minutes after talking to Jarvis. The ride home was blissfully uneventful, and I was thankful for the car radio's companionship. When I got home, I found that Ruth had left a note on the kitchen table. Man called, say to tell you, if you keep looking into his business, you end up dead. He tell me be sure and leave you a note saying exactly that. I sure am sorry if you're having troubles with bad people. You ought to call the police. After having a gun pointed at me, I wasn't about to be frightened by a note, and I wasn't surprised by it either. I'd been scared right down to my socks earlier in the day, but I wasn't going to be deterred from doing my job by a threat given over the phone. It only served to make me angry. Aimo on Matti Kurki's boy had sisu. I slept well that night and woke up more determined than ever to see Burns in jail or dead. Kiitos kaikki. Now, I'm very happy to answer any questions that anyone has about the book. Yes?
When you were writing the book, did you re-walk or revisit any of the places that you talk about in there?
Yes. There's a lot of Berkeley locations in the book. And even for ones I didn't mention, for example, I never in the book mentioned where Uncle Jussi and Aunt Elsa lived, but I still had to find a house where they lived and write that down and go there. So all the locations that I wrote about in Berkeley, there's a few scenes outside of Berkeley, but all those locations I went to. Yes?
I was going to ask, over the years, have you been putting things down as, you know, you were involved with the hall and everybody here?
I mean, had I been writing things?
Yeah.
Well, no. I really hadn't. This was also a way for me to pay back the hall for all the memories I had, and also out of guilt for my failure to have been active over the last years. So I felt that I owed the Finnish community something, and that was part of my inspiration to write the book. But I had so many memories of this place and all the Finns. I have memories of coming here in early December, mid-December, when Joulupukki would provide early presents. That was always a treat. I was on a youth soccer team that was formed by Bay Area Finns, and many of the players were Finnish, and we held functions, fundraisers, and things here. And of course, there were Juhannus gatherings and Vapu and all kinds of other things that I came to and enjoyed. I loved the accordion music, and I loved watching people dance. Even though I was a child of the '60s and something of a hippie and a bad boy, I still loved coming here and recognizing my culture being celebrated. Yeah.
I was wondering about your research process for the book. Was it internal, family, your own experience, or did you also talk to people in the community that were from that time period?
Well, I did a lot of research on what Berkeley was like in 1941. I read Berkeley Gazettes throughout the whole year. But most of that was about the Finnish parts were mostly from memory. The other things, there's a lot of historical events that form the backdrop of the book. Speeches by FDR that they listened to on the radio, or accounts of Charles Lindbergh speeches. He was an isolationist, things like that. That I was pretty thorough in doing my research to get the historical facts right. But most of the things about the Finns came from my own memory. Yeah.
So you have a pretty interesting Nazi spy plot in this thing.
Yeah.
How did American Finns react to us aligning with the Russians who had done so much damage to Finland and that sort of thing? Do you have anything in the book about that?
Not really. Everyone. It was a tricky situation because Finland. My father had fought in the Winter War, and I grew up with this hatred of Russians. Of course, when he met a Russian, he treated like the person. But I mean the Russian government. The Finns were mostly around, especially around that time, were mostly to the left of center. So while they reviled the Russians for what they'd done in invading their country and taking part of their homeland, they had no tolerance for the Nazis. And I didn't find anything. I didn't find anything specific about Finns addressing those issues, but I do know Finns volunteered like everybody else for military duty. Yeah. Yeah. Well, my father. Yeah. By this time, my father had immigrated to New York, and he joined the U.S. Army. Yeah.
Now, since I have been here, I've only been once at the other Finnish Hall, 10th Street.
Yeah.
From your family, what have you heard? How much was the interaction? Did you go to both places? Did they go to both places, or just one?
It was not even talked about. If it somehow came up in conversation, there was silence. These were. It was like the unmentionable back then. This is Part of that, I think, is because this was, we're talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s when the Cold War is raging. And I got a lot from, my father was a barometer for how a lot of Finns felt. And he just had no tolerance for communists. Yeah.
Do we know, is that building just vacated now, or?
Well, that's a good question.
I can't hear the question.
Oh, he asked about the building on 10th Street, the Red Hall. Does anybody know?
It's a converted community center.
Oh, that's right. It's communities.
Yes, this is the last hall run by Finnish nationals and Finnish-Americans in the region.
Yeah.
But at that point, it still retains its identity, but
Right.
it's not run by Finns anymore.
Yeah. So it's yeah.
The Nazi plot, was there any historical accuracy to Nazis in Berkeley or anything like that?
See, that's a good question, because when I wrote the first draft, I thought, this isn't realistic though, is it? I mean, really, Nazis in the Bay Area? So then I saw a book, which I mentioned, I won't look at it, but I mentioned in the acknowledgments about Nazi spies in Hollywood right before the war. So I contacted the author, and he responded the next day. I contacted the author and I asked him, would there have been Nazi spies operating in the Bay Area? And he said, absolutely. They were all over the place, and certainly in the Bay Area. And he told me the German General Counsel in San Francisco, Fritz Wiedemann, knew all about it. And I include Fritz Wiedemann in the book, and Matti goes to interview him. And he's one of two real people. Him and Robert Oppenheimer are the two real people I have in the book. But yeah, there was nothing like what I describe in the book, but there certainly could have been. I was careful not to make it unrealistic. I had to tone down a little bit for my first draft. I was so excited to find out that the premise of my book actually worked. And then I had to make sure that I had it historically right. So I think I did. But yeah, there were Nazis all over. They ultimately, the FBI was pretty good about rooting them out, which is something I mentioned in the book. And also there was a Jewish organization, especially in Los Angeles, that sent spies in, or was able to break up a lot of the Nazi spy rings. Yes?
Have you been part of the ski club?
No, I was when I was a kid. We used to go up there all the time. I think we stopped skiing, or I stopped skiing when I started playing soccer. And then I was obsessed with that. That was my whole life, so.
Our daughter plays there now.
Oh yeah, it's great. I kind of wish I hadn't given it up, but I have found another passion. So, but it was a big place for my family, and I know a lot of Finns went up there all the time in the winter. It's beautiful.
It's nice in the summer.
That's true. Nice in the summer, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
Was there a surge of Finns returning to Finland when the Soviet Union had, let me see, I don't know how to word this. When there were Finns that had become red, that were red.
Right.
And they went back to Finland to move to Russia
Oh, after the revolution?
after the revolution.
Yeah, I don't know if there was a surge, but there was certainly.
I understand
Yeah.
that there were several hundred.
Yeah, I just don't specifically know about this area, but yeah, certainly.
So was there a group from here that left that went back there?
I didn't read about it. I couldn't find anything about that, but I'm sure that there was some. Yeah, I don't know how large a group it was. There was, the Finnish population here grew through the 60s, unclear. The 60s or 70s is when it started to fade or dissipate, and but there's still Finns all over the place. But a lot of Finns started moving back to Finland. And it's interesting, for my father's generation, coming here was paradise, because no nice mild winters, plenty of jobs. My father was in construction like many Finns were. And so he always had work, he had 2 cars, he had a house. It was fantastic for Finns of that generation through the 50s and 60s and 70s. Today, Finland is the happiest place in the world for the 6th year in a row. And people are saying, look at the way the United States is. Look at the problems we have. And many Finns not only aren't coming here, but they're going back. So things, not quite a 180-degree reversal, but it's certainly changed in that respect. Yes, young man.
Hi, Emil. How did you feel, what were your thoughts about Finland as a young boy growing up here in Berkeley? How did you view Finland, and what did you see?
Well, I thought it had to be the greatest place in the world, at least to visit. And when I was 16, my father sent me, every year there was a charter flight that went from Oakland to Finland, a 6-week trip. And when I was 16, my father sent me by myself to Finland, and I stayed with, I met my grandmother, I met several aunts and uncles, my father's siblings, and I spent about 3 or 4 weeks with relatives, and I spent another couple weeks just traveling around on my own. And I'd never seen such beauty before. Such a clean place, and the rivers and the lakes and the trees and everything, and I just thought it was fantastic. So it reaffirmed for me that that this was a beautiful, wonderful place. And then I went back when I was 19, and I had plans to live there. I moved back when I was 19. And then I met a girl from England, and that changed everything. But I spent my whole life intending to move back. Yeah.
Did your family speak Finnish in the home? Because you have some quotations.
Yeah. Well, the father in the book is like my own father. He would switch from English to Finnish. And certain topics were covered in Finnish, and other topics were covered in English. And sometimes for emphasis, he would switch. It was like, it wouldn't matter whether he started in Finnish or started in English, but he'd switch to the other just because it emphasizes the point. It's like when you lower your voice, it gives a little emphasis. People say, what is he going to say? So when he would switch, it was an emphasis. And my mother just spoke English with us, although she was fluent in Finnish. And this is something I noticed about, I knew a lot of Finns my age who were second generation like myself. And I played soccer with a lot of them. And it was interesting, different households had, some would speak only Finnish to their kids, and others just were dedicated to English, and some, like my own, went back and forth. So among Finns of my generation, we had varying degrees of fluency in Finnish. When I was okay with, I was pretty good with Finnish when I was a kid. Then when I went to Finland and spent 6 weeks there, I was darn near fluent. So I think.
Because I'm of Swedish extraction. The Swedes came to America and they dropped their language and culture like a hot rock.
Yeah.
What was the question?
Well, the Swedes, I'm of Swedish heritage, and the Swedes tend to just, when they came to America, just drop their culture and their language and just become pure American.
Right.
And I've seen those different temperaments in the Finns, so it's such a similar cultural otherwise.
Yeah, that's the thing about like the Finns here is the success at both assimilating and maintaining their heritage. Yes.
I'm thinking maybe that's partly a generational thing.
Yeah.
My grandmother, my mother was never spoke Finnish in the house because they felt that the kids should just speak English. And it was like, it was a big thing for them. And so that was, you know, it was an earlier generation.
Yeah, yes.
So I think that might be the difference.
I've heard the saying that it was generational. It was a generation who felt that, okay, here we are, we're in America, we're going to be Americans. And then later I've had the people express to me that they feel they really missed out
Yeah,
because they didn't hear that Finnish and wish they had.
I've heard that a lot too. Yeah,
Yeah.
people feel like they missed out.
Yeah, my mother was very disappointed that she didn't speak Finnish.
Yeah, yeah. I think it depended too on the level of English, because my mother was born in 1918, and her father, my grandfather, didn't speak any English. Even when I was little, he didn't speak English. And so they always spoke Finn in the house, and she started the first grade not knowing a word of English. And she said she sat there and she realized after a few minutes that the only person in the whole school that she could talk to was her sister, and that she didn't know how to ask to go to the bathroom.
Yeah. Well, I remember among all these Finns that most of them, well, virtually all of them were pretty good at with their English. And I know my father and some other Finns really had disdain for those Finns who didn't pick up English well. He thought that was very bad. Yeah.
So how did your parents get news from Finland? And how did they get
Yeah, well, my father got the hometown, the Nivala newspaper. My father was from a small town called Nivala in northern Finland, not too far from, near Ylivieska and not too far from Kemi, I guess. So he got that newspaper. I think it came weekly, and he got a lot of letters, of course. So those were his sources.
Was there a Finnish radio program here at that time? Here?
Probably, but it seems like there was, but I don't remember anybody, at least in my immediate family, listening to it or talking about it. Yeah.
I remember, sometime in the 60s, there was an hour program with, I want to say, Rolf and Helgi Quist, and they had this Finnish 1 hour program.
On TV or
on
in radio? Okay.
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have been doing that. I did that in,
Yeah.
several years.
Remember? Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
With naming the characters, was it pretty significant? Each character, like putting a name to their
Yes.
character, and
So, for example, Matti's last name is Kurki, and that was my maternal, my mother's maiden name. My mother was Kerttu or Gertrude Kurki, and Matti's sister is Kerttu. Matti's father is Aimo, like my father, but I gave the mother the name Toini. I had an aunt Toini. My uncle's name was Unto, and I didn't think that would work in a book. It would look like Antu. So I named him Jorma after my favorite cousin in Finland. And Elsa was my aunt's name. And Helen was a cousin's name. Jussi was a friend's name. And Inga-Lisa is just a name I wanted to have a third daughter to name her Inga-Lisa, but yeah. I love that name, so I gave it to her. And then I had characters like the Pulkinens, and that was my grandmother's...
One of her names.
Yeah, one of her names. That's a long story. But so there was... and then I named one character, his last name was Pelonpää, named after a Finnish actor who's in many of Kurismäki's movies. And I gave another the last name of a Finnish man who was lynched in Minnesota for radical activities, and he was a famous martyr to many Finns.
What was he radical about?
He was just in the labor movement. Yeah, he wasn't even a communist. It's an interesting story that I don't know. There's not that much information about it, but he's still considered a martyr to the labor movement, even by non-Finns.
So the bully in your extract was named Samako?
Yeah, that means frog.
That means frog.
Yeah, and that was my little in-joke to Finns. Because I don't think anybody's got the last name. Has anybody heard of the last name Samako before?
No.
Yeah, so I thought this will be my in-joke. I'll give the worst character the name, this name.
I think I've gotten the joke.
Yeah, yeah.
Speaking of men in labor, this past month we celebrated Mina Khan's birthday. And she was one heck of an individual.
Yeah.
How did you treat Finnish women in your novel?
Well, there's two particular women in the novel. One is Matti's mother. And what I did was I made her a kind of a conglomeration of a lot of the Finnish women that I grew up around, like my grandmother. Very hardworking women who did all the cooking and the cleaning and participated in all the church activities and brotherhood activities like my grandmother did. She was always doing that sort of thing. So, and I've had so far 2 or 3 people tell me that the mother in the book reminds them of their mother. So I think I got that right. But I wanted to do something different with the girlfriend. I made Martta a very liberated woman. I mean, just the fact that she came from Minnesota and to study economics in Berkeley made her a little different than most women of that time period. But I also had her have her own mind and stand up to Matti. And that's one thing I wanted to do. Even though the book was set in the 1941, I wanted to be sensitive to today's political environment. So I had a strong woman. I had a strong female African-American character. Matti has a maid, but she's a very smart woman who's helping raise or work her daughter through college. And there's an incident with a gay character, and Matti expresses sympathy with somebody who's gay at that time, as opposed to the homophobia that one normally expected. So I tried to bring a little bit of modern sensibility to the book without making it anachronistic. Any other questions? Okay, yes.
Last one. I played Santa Claus upstairs when I was 18.
Wow.
Were you one of the children that
Well, it depends on what year it was.
What year were you
59?
Oh, yeah. That could have been. I was 5 then, so I would have been the very polite young man.
Not the one that cried.
No. No, my father wouldn't have permitted that. There was no crying. I don't. That's one thing about. He was a great father. He was a great grandfather, as some of his grandchildren are here will testify. But he really instilled into me the idea that boys don't cry. And so, but that was a product of the time. Okay. Any other questions?